Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 42 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Arizona Coyotes, in which the Sharks have won 4-2. This was the second matchup against Arizona this season and their second victory against the Coyotes this year as well. And while this would normally be a good thing, it would actually honestly be like the perfect style of game that you would like to play if the Sharks were an actual competitive playoff team. You come in here, the first game of a road trip, you come against a team that's lower in the standings. You don't want to give them much, but you also don't want to expend ton of energy here at the beginning of the road trip. And the Sharks did exactly that. They play well, they control the pace. It's not as though they're completely dominant, but they don't give the Coyotes much, and they get the 4 goals, they get the victory, they get the 2 points. All in all, a very solid game for a normal season, like I said. But this is not really a normal season, though I guess technically it is the new norm for the San Jose Sharks over these past few seasons, where they actually are at the bottom of the standings, meaning that this victory, which would normally be a very nice thing against the Coyotes, is instead kind of bad, as the San Jose Sharks are indeed vying with the Coyotes for the lowest possible spot in the standings. And compared, let's say, to a few days ago to the Chicago Blackhawks win, which was relatively inconsequential because it's going to be very difficult for the Sharks to catch the Blackhawks, who are just exceedingly bad this season, the Sharks are competing pretty directly with the Coyotes for these last few bottom spots. And with this victory, the Sharks actually passed the Coyotes and now find themselves 5th last in the league in terms of points percentage, while the Coyotes are 4th last. So this is essentially what they call a 4-point game, though that term is usually used when it's two teams vying for a playoff spot, where when one gets the victory, it's a 4-point swing, because not only do they get 2 points, but the team that they're fighting for the playoff spot with gets 0 points. Sort of on the opposite side of things, now the Sharks want to get as low as possible in the standings, and they get the 2 points here tonight, while the Coyotes get none, and yet one more game passes in the schedule. So a bit of a sort of awkward situation for the San Jose Sharks. A couple of months ago, when the Sharks lost that game to the Vegas Golden Knights, I believe it was 4-2. This was back near the beginning of the season. I made a mention of how the Sharks are not going to go 0-82 through a full year, and you're going to get some of those wins, obviously, and you want to get some of those wins against the Vegas Golden Knights, teams like that, because they're the rivals and they're fun to see them beat. These are the types of games against the Coyotes. These are the types of games that you want to get those losses against, because they are very consequential for your final standing spot. And yet the Sharks, they find themselves 2-0 against Arizona. On to the actual game here. This one starts off with the Sharks scoring the first goal from Kevin Labanc, his 10th of the season, hitting double digits, before the Coyotes then tie it up with a goal from Barrett Hayton and then take the lead with a goal from Christian Fischer to be a 2-1 lead at the end of the first period. In the second period, there would only be one goal scored, and that would come from San Jose. Nico Sturm with an absolute beauty of a goal to tie this game up at 2. If this were like a bigger name player, you'd probably see this goal make the rounds of all of the highlight packages and everything of that nature, but because it's Nico Sturm, you probably won't hear too much about it. But still, this was a very nice goal, and that would be the score at the end of the second period. The game is tied at 2. In the third, it would not remain tied at 2 for long, not very long at all, as Matt Nieto would score just 9 seconds into the third period, very close to beating a Sharks franchise record for fastest goal to start a period, but not to be. However, with that 3-2 lead, the Sharks would manage to shut things down very well. While they weren't necessarily generating a ton of chances for themselves, they were giving very little to Arizona, and eventually the Sharks would actually get another goal, not an empty netter, from Jacob Megna, his first of the season, to make it 4-2. And even when the Coyotes managed to pull the goaltender, the Sharks were actually getting some decent clears out there, had a couple of good opportunities to score in the empty net, but they just barely missed it a couple of times, and so it would be a final score of 4-2. On to the players to talk about here. We have the first line of Meyer, Hurdle, and Labanc. Certainly not a bad game for the first line, though I will say this was one of Meyer's weaker games as of late. Usually he's been really the driving force for the San Jose Sharks, not only as on the first line, but just generally for the forwards, and I didn't necessarily notice Meyer as much here tonight. Still a decent game, sort of relative to the rest of the team, but compared to his usual performances, it was a bit muted. But the more interesting player to talk about on his line is actually Kevin Labanc, because Labanc scored that goal early on. That was his 10th of the season, the double digits, something that you weren't necessarily expecting coming into this year after what happened last year. He played a few games, then had a massive season-ending injury, and then coming into this year, you weren't sure if he would even get a top 6 spot, things of that nature, but he's found a decent spot here on the top line with Hertl and Meier. But after scoring this goal, he ends up getting victimized on the Christian Fischer goal at neutral ice. Fischer spots this play and reads it well. He knows a stretch pass could come, and as such, he sort of zooms through the neutral zone. Kevin Labanc, this is his man. He does not follow him, or he follows him, but much more lazily, which allows Fischer the opportunity to get this essentially a breakaway and score this goal to make it 2-1. David Quinn does not like this at all and actually decides to bench Labanc, not for the rest of the game, but for an extended period of time, which I found to be an interesting call, to say the least. There have been many individual errors from many different San Jose Sharks players over this season. I mean, I'm pretty sure every single player has done that, but just off the top of my head, Benning, Vlasic, Carlson, Ferraro definitely, especially as of late. And then on the forward side, we've seen that from Barabanov, Bonino, Sturm even, Couture even at times as well. Pretty much all of the fourth line in general, and yet rarely do we see this type of benching. So the fact that Labanc got it, I guess, was pretty telling of maybe some things behind the scenes. Don't want to necessarily start any rumors, but it is quite interesting. However, later on, Labanc kind of makes up for that with an extra assist on the Megna goal. So he gets a goal and an assist while having not played like a decent chunk of the game, missing many shifts on that top line. So certainly an odd one for him. On the second line, we have Nieto, Couture, and Barabanov once again a pretty effective line for the San Jose Sharks. Barabanov has just found such flexibility here on this second line. I remember it was back at the end of the 2021 season when he came over from the deadline in exchange for Antti Suomela from the Maple Leafs. He found himself on that top line with Kane and Hertl, did very well last season. He ends up on the top line with Hertl and Meier instead, still does very well, and now today, this season as of late, he finds himself on the second line with Logan Couture, who he had previously played very little with, and yet he is still finding strong success. Like I said, a very flexible player here in this second line role, and definitely a big boost for the San Jose Sharks. That trade, that Antti Suomela for Barabanov, is like sort of low-key, I guess you could say, one of the best trades that the Sharks have made in recent memory, I must say. And then, of course, I also do want to bring up Nieto once again. He does score a goal here, his 8th of the season. He continues to find himself some actual use on this second line, which continues to, of course, surprise me. However, the big story of the game, you could say, is on the third line here. Bonino and Sturm, nothing very important there. But the third player here is a new face on this Sharks roster, which is not something I thought I'd be saying a ton of, since the management is very rigid in who they are actually playing and deciding to bring up from the minors. But off of waivers, they pick up Michael Eyssimont from the Winnipeg Jets. He comes in here, and his description as a player was, he's tough to play against. And usually when I hear he's tough to play against, this is essentially telling me that this guy is not a very good player. This is, it's definitely not the type of description that I like to hear. Not because that it's a bad thing to be a player who is tough to play against. Obviously, a player who is tough to play against, just by the literal definition of that, would be a good thing for a team. But the thing is that it is basically a hockey cliche where when they say, oh, he's tough to play against, it usually means that they don't really bring a lot to the table besides sort of being like an enforcer type of guy. You see, like if I was going to describe Jeff Viel, I would probably say, well, he's tough to play against because he doesn't really bring a lot to the table besides sort of hitting people and getting into fights. So I was expecting that type of player, a Jeff Viel type of player, but actually I was pleasantly surprised with Eysimont's performance here tonight. In particular, in the first period, it definitely felt like he wasn't really given a ton of shifts as this game went on. In fact, he actually had the least ice time in the entire game for the San Jose Sharks, with below 10 minutes, but when he did play, when he was playing, especially in that first period, I thought he had some very effective shifts, and I also thought he really reinvigorated the other two players on this line, Bonino and Sturm. In particular, Sturm is the player who, on average, over these 42 games, I would say has been decent for the San Jose Sharks, but ever since like the beginning of the season where he was one of the better players for the Sharks, he has kind of gone on and been very average, middle of the pack, sometimes kind of bad as well, and it was nice to see him actually have a pretty good game here tonight. I won't say because of the presence of this new player on his line, but I'm sure that didn't hurt him either. So pretty solid game from Eyssimont. I imagine he will get another look in the Sharks' upcoming game tomorrow against the Los Angeles Kings, though maybe because it is a back-to-back, it's possible he also sits out for that one as well. On the fourth line, to quickly go through that, once again, a pretty decent game for the fourth line. Gadjevich is as well, once again, the standout here, in my opinion, on the fourth line. Has actually become sort of the driving force there. Previously, it had been Lorentz. Now it's Gadjevich, and maybe if all three of those players can actually get rolling at the same time, Gadjevich, Lorentz, and Lindblom, it could actually be a pretty effective fourth line for the Sharks. On to the defensive side of things, we of course have the top pairing of Megna and Karlsson, which had some solid success here. Megna in particular, obviously he scores this goal, but he was also taking a lot more shots this game than usual. I mean, it's not as though he ended with a ton. I think he only had 3 by the end of the game, but that's more than he usually gets, especially on this pairing with Erik Karlsson. So it was interesting to see him maybe elect more for shots towards the goal, and he was rewarded for that. But it's actually the bottom 2 pairings that are very interesting, because we actually had a bit of a switch. Vlasic and Benning had been playing together for very, very long now at this point. It feels like it's been like a couple of months, but they've finally been separated, which I definitely don't think is a bad idea, because while they were very good originally, they haven't been particularly good together as of late. Vlasic has been quite bad. He gets moved down to the third pairing with Harrington, and it is Ferraro, who has also been quite bad, who gets bumped up to play with Matt Benning. Now, the result of this is that third pairing of Harrington and Vlasic looked decent enough. Nothing amazing there, but certainly not a liability, I would say, at times this game. However, the Ferraro-Benning pairing, still kind of a struggle. I mean, Benning has just generally returned to earth. His season has really just been up and down and up and down. He starts off quite bad, then he ends up being actually pretty good. Now he's back down to being kind of bad. So I haven't been super impressed with Benning as of late. And of course, Ferraro, it's not been an up and down season for him. It's been a mostly just down season for Mario Ferraro. One of the most disappointing players, in my opinion, for the San Jose Sharks thus far this season. And even with this new assignment here on the second pairing, it didn't necessarily make up for it a ton, though of course generally it was a positive game for the Sharks. It's not as though they played terribly defensively. It's just I was expecting more from Ferraro for just the majority of this season thus far. And then finally, to mention the goaltender here, we had Kakkonen back between the pipes. A solid game for him, only lets in the couple of goals here. Generally, I'm not going to draw too many sweeping conclusions from this. This is a game against the Arizona Coyotes. It's like that performance he had against the Chicago Blackhawks, where you're like, oh wow, 2 goals. Is Kakkonen back? Not really. He's just playing against a kind of easy opponent, and no offense to the Coyotes, but they are kind of exactly that. We'll see if he can actually put up an impressive performance against an actual good team at some point. But that would do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow, where they will take on the Los Angeles Kings, a team that is much better and actually in the playoffs compared to the Arizona Coyotes. And so I imagine on the second half of the back-to-back, the Sharks will have their work cut out for them. We'll see what happens. Class dismissed.